As a salon or spa owner, cosmetology school gave you the skills to serve clients, but it definitely didn't teach you how to run a business. Somewhere along the way, you probably thought ownership would mean freedom, but instead you're working more hours than ever, barely paying yourself, and low-key worried everything's going to fall apart the second you step away. Welcome to the Beauty Biz Breakdown, where we give you the real strategies, systems, and structure that you need to fully step into the CEO seat in your beauty business. Hey friends, welcome back to the Beauty Biz Breakdown, where salon and spa owners learn to build bigger, better, and more profitable beauty businesses. I'm Brie, and as always, I have the best co-host ever here with me today. Hey Chandra, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing good today.
Awesome. Well, today's episode is one that I wish I would have personally listened to years ago, and one that I wish more owners would listen to before they sign anything, before they get a bank loan, and honestly, before they get emotionally attached to a space that they think is their dream opportunity. We're going to talk about buying an existing salon or spa and the due diligence checklist that nobody actually gives you or really talks about, I think, in the beauty industry. Most of the time on paper, buying an existing salon or spa, it can look like the fast track. It can look like it's just the way to go, like a no-brainer. You get to skip the build-out nightmare. You inherit a client base. You get a team that is already filling the chairs, systems that look like they're in place, and it feels like you're stepping into something that's already in motion or already working. But something that Chandra and I have seen over and over again in this industry is people buying into something without fully understanding what they're actually stepping into. And then a few months later, they sit there and they're realizing this is not what they thought it was going to be at all. It wasn't a shortcut after all. It was something they now have to untangle and kind of completely rebuild. And I'm going to be honest with everybody out there. There are a lot of layers that go into buying an existing salon or spa, way more than we could ever fit into one podcast episode. So instead of trying to cover everything, we are going to walk through like the biggest things that Chandra and I see that either make this a really smart move or something people end up completely and totally regretting. I think there's really 5 main areas that people need to look at before you even think about moving forward. I wasn't even aware of these 5 areas when I bought a pre-existing salon, and I wish I would have known them. It's the numbers, how much of the business is tied to the owner, how the team is actually producing, how that team is being paid, and then the legal side of how everything is set up. Those are the 5 most important things that you really need to think about. I also want to say this really, really quickly. This episode is not about scaring you out of buying an existing salon or spa. That is not what we're trying to do here at all. It's about making sure that you actually understand what you're looking at before you make a life-altering decision, because that's what buying a business is. Chandra, when you hear someone say that they're buying an existing salon or an existing spa, where do you feel like people get a little too excited a little too quickly?
I think they just see the surface of what's happening in that business and they think it's just going to be super easy and they think, "Oh, they already have all these things," and they just get really excited that they just think it's already been done. And I think they're just looking at that surface level.
100%. That's exactly what I did. I mean, I looked at things. I'm not dumb, right? But I definitely let my emotions kind of run ahead of me instead of using my brain and logic in a lot of areas. And I wish I wouldn't have done that. So let's kind of start where things usually go wrong first. Most people walk into this thinking that they're buying something that is already working. I think this was my problem. I get why people think that because on the surface, like Chandra said, it can look like that, right? It looks busy. The numbers look good, or the little bit of numbers that you see. And it can feel like something that you could just step into, take over, and it's going to run the exact same way. But here is where people kind of misunderstand what you're actually buying, because you're not buying a salon that works on its own. You're buying a business that is producing results based on how it has been led up until the point that you start looking at it. And that is a very, very different thing than just walking into something and taking it over. The money that you're seeing in those numbers, it doesn't just happen, right? It came from specific decisions that were made, habits that were allowed, how the team was led, what's been expected, what's been ignored, and what systems were either built or never built in the first place. So when you're looking at the numbers, you're not just looking at something that's guaranteed to continue. You're looking at the outcome of how that business has been operating. And if you don't understand how those things are driving the revenue, you don't actually understand the business. And this was the mistake that I made for sure. I think that's why you have to be really, really careful that once you get past that number, the asking price number, and you start hearing numbers that they use to justify things, it can really get kind of cloudy because those numbers are the result of everything that we just talked about, right? But if you don't understand what is actually behind them in every single area, you can easily assume that the business you're looking at is way stronger than what it really is. Chandra, we've seen this happen over and over again, and it can get people in a lot of trouble. When someone tells you, look, we did $1 million last year, that can't impress you guys. It can't. You have to slow down when they start saying things like that because that number by itself, it doesn't tell you if the business is healthy or not. It really doesn't tell you anything. All it tells you is that money came into the business. And I think that's where a lot of people make a big mistake. I know I did. Chandra, why is that such a big mistake?
Because I think they hear that figure and they're like, "Oh, $1 million," but they're not putting together what that $1 million, where it went, where it goes. Is that owner even keeping anything? And is the owner the one making all $1 million pretty much? Because I think those are the things that people don't, they just hear that shiny number like, "Oh, it's making $1 million. I'm going to buy it for 500,000 or something crazy." Because I see that stuff all the time, and it usually ends in disaster.
It does. It absolutely does. So I'm sure you guys know what we're going to say, but number one is the financials. That is the first thing you have to look at. And I think the really important part to remember here is that this has to go way deeper than someone just showing you a few numbers and expecting you to feel good about it. You actually need to understand everything behind those numbers because I think this is what happens a lot of time. People ask for the numbers, they look at them very, very quickly or just kind of glance over them, and then they move on to something else. And one of the reasons is a lot of salon and spa owners don't like numbers. So we just look at something very surface level and kind of move on. But you cannot barely scratch the surface when it comes to these numbers. If you are thinking about buying a business, you are going to have to go a lot deeper than that. You need real financials. And you need enough of them to see what this business has looked like over time. At a minimum, I would say you need at least 3 full years. And I'm just going to say this, if the previous owner cannot give you that, or if they seem weird about giving you that, I would make that slow you down immediately. 1 good year doesn't really tell us anything. A couple of strong recent months don't tell you much either. You need multiple years so you can spot patterns, not just look at a pretty snapshot. And I feel that's like what most salon owners kind of give is that snapshot. One thing people try to give you also is a cleaned up summary. And trust me when I say you don't want that either. That's what I got. And it was a huge mistake. You need a full profit and loss statement where you can actually see how the money is coming in and where every single penny is going. And when you get those P&Ls, you cannot just fly through those either. You need to spend quite a bit of time analyzing them. You want to start by separating out service revenue and retail revenue and look at those individually. When you do this, I think it allows you to see signs. Maybe, for instance, if retail is barely being sold, that should tell you something right away about how that team has been trained, what's been expected, and probably what has not been prioritized in the business. Chandra, why is that so important?
Well, I think you don't know what the clear picture is. Salon owners are really, really good at making things look really, really pretty. And so I think that they have a way of, because I've looked at in salons that I've purchased or looked into purchasing before too, and it's like this perfect little packet, like all these things that seem like they're going to be great. And then when you do start digging in, like you said, and you start seeing all the things, the real picture, you start to realize like if that business is actually worth it or not. And I think you can't ever just look at that little surface like this is what they're telling you, this is what they're showing you. You have to dig deep into those financials and dig deep into every little part of the business. Like you said, the retail sales and all those things, they need to be analyzed before you jump in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the next thing that people probably need to look at is those expenses, right? And not just the total number at the bottom, not just what they add up to. I'm talking everything: payroll, rent, supplies, software, subscriptions, marketing, merchant fees, literally every single penny that has been spent. And you have to go through that. And I think the questions that you should be asking yourself in your head is, does this actually make sense for a business this size? That is one of the questions that I wish I would have asked. Because if you start seeing money sitting in all of these random places on this P&L, or you see a bunch of stuff thrown into categories like miscellaneous, that's not going to tell you anything. It's actually a huge red flag. That's not something you can just skip over. That is something that I would absolutely be asking about, like interrogating the owner about. Because the last thing that you want to do is walk into a business where you don't fully understand where that money is going every single month. Period. That's the last thing that you don't want to understand. And I think you also need to be looking at how consistent those numbers are across those 3 years. Are they steady? Are they all over the place? Did revenue drop at certain points? Did it randomly spike right before the business went up for sale? I'm talking to myself here because that's exactly what happened to me. All of that stuff matters when you're trying to figure out whether this business has actually been stable or whether it just had a few moments where it looks strong, right? You've got to know that answer. And I think the bigger question sitting underneath all of this is, if you took this salon over exactly as it is today, would it actually support you? And I don't mean just keep your doors open. I mean, would it pay you for running the business? Would it support your team? Would it cover your expenses? And would it still allow you room to grow? Because if the numbers are already tight before you even step into ownership, they are not going to magically feel better once that salon becomes yours. Chandra, when someone is looking at the financials and everything seems fine on the surface, where do you usually see things start to fall apart once they actually start digging in?
I think some of the biggest things are the payroll side. I think that it looks like a certain way, but then when they start going in there, they realize that their payroll percentages are really, really high, and there's no way they're ever going to actually make any money off of that business that way. And I think the other things too is really, I think a big one for our industry is the owner's expenses like actually tied to the business personally, or have they separated those things? Because that's another thing that I've found looking into these situations, is that sometimes the owners got their finances all entangled and you don't actually really know what's happening inside that business. I feel like our industry is so all over the place. And so I think when you start digging into those things, you start seeing that clear picture. And then how much revenue is actually coming in from that team. And those are the other things to look at when it comes to those financials. Is the owner bringing in all the revenue, or is that team actually bringing in most of that revenue? And I think those are some of the top things I see people get in trouble with right away when they jump into those situations without digging deeper.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into those just a little bit because I think you brought up some really good points and points that actually really matter. So let's get into like the revenue that is actually coming from the current owner behind the chair. I think this is where a lot of people start to realize real quickly that the numbers they saw on paper don't always tell the full story. So if you are out there and you're looking at something like this, you need a breakdown of revenue by provider before you ever think about purchasing. Not just one big total for the salon overall. You need to see what each and every person on that team is producing so you can understand how the business is actually functioning day to day. And like Chandra and I have both said, the first place that you should be looking at is that owner. How much are they producing consistently and how booked are they on a daily basis? I think that tells you right away how much of the business is directly tied to that owner being there. And that is a huge, huge thing that you need to know. And you've got to be really honest with yourself when you look at that number, I think, because that revenue is now not guaranteed to stay once they step out, even if there is a transition plan, even if that owner promises that they will introduce you to every single client personally, right? You just can't assume that that money is going to stay there. I think once you get through the owner's numbers, you have to look at the rest of the team as a whole, like Chandra said. And this you need to really look at. Is it a lot of people doing well? Is it a few people doing well? I would really be paying attention to how the revenue is spread out. I think that's the best way to put it, because this is where you start to see if the business actually has stability or if it's being held up by a very small number of people. What you want to know is, does this feel somewhat balanced, or is most of the business being carried by two top producers or three top producers? Those are real different situations that you have to think about. If you've got a team of 8, but the owner and 2 other stylists are producing 85% of the revenue, no, thank you. Absolutely not. And you need to hear this, because on paper, yes, that looks good. It looks busy. The yearly revenue can look super strong. It can feel great. But underneath that, you are walking into a very, very fragile situation. You already know the owner's production's at risk, right? The second that ownership changes, that alone should make you pause. But if the rest of the team is also heavily dependent on 1 or 2 other people, now you have risk stacked on top of risk. And I have seen this happen more times than I can count. That ownership changes, 1 or 2 of those top producers decide that they don't want to stay through the transition. Maybe they were already halfway out the door. Maybe they were loyal to the previous owner. Maybe they just don't like freaking change. I don't know. Sometimes they'll even stay for a little bit and then leave like 2 months into it. It really doesn't matter why they're leaving. It matters that you've got revenue sitting heavily on a few shoulders, and 1 or 2 exits can completely change the financial picture of that business almost overnight. Chandra, we have seen people lose their marbles because this happens. Talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our industry has very finicky people in it, and I think that happens a lot where someone new comes in, and whether the existing team gives them a chance or not, they will leave. And that's the thing with the salon, because your revenue is coming from services that these people provide. And so if they walk, they could take clients. You don't know what's been happening in that business from the beginning, and they're giving out information, they're doing all this shady stuff. And so the second you take over thinking you're walking into something really great, ends up completely being the opposite of that. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we see. And then I think too, like if you are making changes or things like that to the existing business, you have to go in with the mindset that you may lose half that team. And you have to figure out how are you going to make it work if that happens, because you can't just assume that all these people are going to just fall in with whatever changes you're going to make or how you plan to run it, because it's probably going to be different. And so I think those are some of the biggest issues that we see with that when that happens. It's a hard industry with that stuff. I mean, I went through it when I bought a salon one time, and I knew that whole team was going to leave because I knew the culture, I knew the owner really well, and I didn't really want that team anyways because I knew they weren't our culture, but I wanted the space. And so it was a situation that worked out really good, but I went into it knowing that none of those people were going to stay, and I wasn't planning on having any of those people stay. And so I think those are the things you got to look at and figure out what your plan is if those situations happen.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's we've seen it go both ways, right? Where owners take over and they're praying and crossing their fingers and just hoping that everybody stays, and then they have a complete meltdown when they don't. And then we've seen it the opposite, like you, where you just want the space. You already have a plan for employees to move over, take ownership of that space, and so you're in a good spot. So it's really, really important. Once you understand who is actually producing the revenue and how that's kind of spread across the team, I think the next thing we have to dig a little bit deeper into is something that you mentioned earlier, Chandra, and that is how people are being paid and what you're really stepping into from a payroll standpoint the second that you take over. I think this is where things get super, super messy if you don't slow down and really look at things, because on the surface, payroll, it always looks kind of straightforward. It just does. You can see what people are making, you see percentages, right? And it looks like something you can just keep running in the same way. But payroll isn't just about what's being paid out right now. It's about whether that structure actually makes sense for the business as you step into it, and whether it's something that you can realistically sustain. This is something that people don't think about. You walk into a salon that's paying 55, 60% in commission. We all know that's stupid. Like, we know that. We can't walk in and keep that. That is going to hurt us very, very bad. And so you have to look at that. So, what you need to look at is a full breakdown of how every single person on the team is being paid, not general answers like, oh, they're all commission, or, well, we kind of do hourly plus tips. Specifics, guys, very specific. What percentage is each stylist on? Are there tiers or is everyone on a flat rate? Are there bonuses? Are there guarantees? Is anything layered in? What does it look like? Are people in the same role being paid differently? Because you have to actually see what you're inheriting instead of just assuming that it's clean and consistent and that you can keep doing it. Chandra, this is an area that we have seen people have to close their doors over, literally. What do people really need to look at when they're looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think the biggest thing you should ask for is our payroll reports. And there's no reason you can't ask for those kinds of documents when you're going through a process like this. And if they can't provide those, then that's a red flag right there, too. Like, they should need to have some sort of documentation. And then you can do your own research and looking at the revenue and the sales, looking at those payroll reports, really picking apart like how much of the revenue is actually going to payroll. And I mean, I went through a situation where I didn't buy the salon, but you might even remember, Brie, when I did that, because a salon owner I know was selling their salon, and they had been through previous other coaching programs that I know what the benchmarks look like and are, and they've been around for many, many years, and I know who they are. And I thought that their payroll maybe was sort of similar to what I do. And when I got in there and started looking, their payroll was a disaster. They were paying some people 60%. They had some people 1099. They had stuff that I was like, there's no way I could ever change any of this for these people, because this is what they've been doing for 15 years, and B, ever be profitable, because it was just such a disaster mess. And that was not anything I had ever expected from this company that I was looking at purchasing. So you just never know. So once you start looking at the payroll reports, that's what I did. And I was like, wait a minute, person's not getting payroll taxes taken out. And then they're like, oh yeah, they're 1099. And this this doesn't make any sense. You paid them almost all their revenue they brought in. So you really have to dig through it. And even the owner was kind of confused. And I was like, how's this happening? So do your research.
Absolutely. And I think, a big piece of that too is that's not only a pay issue, that is a leadership issue. And so you have to think about that. You are walking into a leadership issue that is kind of all over the place, and you can't ignore any of that. You can't ignore people being on all different kinds of pays and commission structures and all different. You just can't. Like, you also can't assume that you can come in and change it overnight without any pushback, because that, I can promise you, is going to cause problems. You need to know exactly what you are walking into before you decide to buy anything. I'm telling you. And I think another piece that we need to talk about, because you did bring this up, is classification. People get in trouble with this without realizing it. In fact, there are still way too many salon owners out there that either don't know or they're playing stupid and still misclassifying people. Sorry, I don't mean that to sound harsh, but there is so much information out there now. Like, people know, they know, and they're still trying to get away with it. You need to know if these team members are W-2 employees. Are they booth renters? Are they somewhere in between? Is it a hybrid situation? Are they commission on 1099, which shouldn't happen? Like, you have to know how this was created. Chandra, let's talk about these setups just a little bit. I know that this is such a gray area in our industry, but why is this so important to make sure that when you are coming in, especially if you are looking at purchasing a commission salon, that everybody is a W-2?
Yeah, well, I mean, legally for yourself, that's the way to do it. Like, you can't take those 1099 people in and keep doing it the same way and not be worried about getting in trouble yourself. And then I think the other thing is, when they're used to doing something a certain way, that owner has probably painted that picture for them as to why this is a beneficial way to do something. And so you coming in and taking that away or changing that, it's very difficult. It's very tricky. And I think that can cause a lot of problems for you stepping in to take over this new business. So I think it's really important that you understand what you're getting into, what these people are used to, and what you might need to change if you're going to do that, and figure out, what the best plan is to do that. But you can't just assume that you can just come in and change stuff and they're going to all be happy, even if it is for their benefit, which it would be if you were changing them over from like a 1099 to a W-2. But it's just, those are hard situations and you have to be prepared for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've seen a lot of issues with that for sure. I also think this is something I just thought of, but you need to make sure that you're looking for any additional payroll obligations that aren't super obvious. Things like maybe paid time off, right? Guarantees, back bar coverage, because we know some people are doing parts and labor now, education stipends, ongoing bonuses, anything that has been promised or expected, because those things can add up really, really quickly. And they don't always show up clearly when someone just says, this is what payroll runs each month. That's why those reports and things are so important. There's a difference between what's being paid right now and what's been promised moving forward. And you have to be able to understand both of those. I think people don't think about this part enough. If the pay structure isn't strong or clear, it is going to affect retention, period. If people are confused about how they get paid, if it feels inconsistent, if it feels unfair, that is going to create tension like you've never known before. And that tension is usually going to show up the second that something changes, especially when something like ownership changes. So you've got to look at all the payroll stuff. Chandra, when you've seen owners take over a business with an existing team, because we coach people through this all the time, how often do you really think payroll structures end up being one of the first things that creates tension or needs to be reworked?
I think that's like probably majority of the time, to be honest, that happens. I think that's probably the number one thing too, that you're going to shake up that team right away when you come in and make those changes. So I would say that's probably the biggest issue and the biggest challenge when it comes to taking over existing teams.
Yeah, it definitely is. But I do want people to know that there's hope out there, because there is a way to transition it, to implement it, to create it, to do all of these things in a way that will work. I'm not saying it's going to be easy by any means, but Chandra and I coach people through this all the time, and you can make it work, especially when you are doing it for the better of the business and the employees that are there. Okay, now let's talk about the lease and the space itself, because this is one of those areas that can feel really straightforward at first, but there are a lot of details here that can really impact you long after that excitement of buying the business kind of wears off. And I think this is where people can get a little too emotional or too emotionally attached to a specific space. They love how it looks. They love, the location. They can picture themselves in it. And they kind of just assume that the lease piece is going to transfer over clean and just be what it is. But this is not something that you want to just assume your way through. I promise you that. The first thing to understand is you're usually not just stepping into that lease exactly as it sits without anything changing. Very, very rarely does that happen. Most of the time, the landlord has to approve the transfer, and sometimes they'll want to renegotiate the terms altogether, like immediately. So you need to have a very clear picture of what that process looks like before you get too far into this. Because the last thing you want is to build your entire plan around this specific space and then find out the lease terms are changing, or the landlord is harder to work with than what you expected, or any of that stuff. You want to look at the terms very, very closely. Look at them in detail. How much time is left? What do rent increases look like over time? Are there additional fees outside of the base rent, like CAM charges, utilities, maintenance, shared expenses that are going to fluctuate? Sometimes what looks like a very reasonable rent number on paper ends up being a lot higher once all of those pieces get added in. This is exactly what happened to me. I was told that the rent was $4,000 a month. However, I was not told about any of the other fees. And thank God I had an attorney, because he pulled everything up. The rent actually ended up being almost $14,000 with the CAM fees and everything else added in. That's a drastic difference. 10 grand a month is huge. So you want to make sure that you understand the full picture when it comes to this. Chandra, how could this absolutely demolish somebody's financials if they're not paying attention to it? And how could it affect their business longevity wise if they just purchase and hope everything's going to work out?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of just like what you said, it can affect your financials pretty drastically because if you're budgeting in your mind as you're setting up this business, on your end, what that's going to look like, and then the rent ends up being double or more, then you're going to be in financial trouble right away. And I think the biggest thing is really like get an attorney involved, start looking at that stuff, start seeing what you're actually getting because there are so many. I've looked at so many leases for different buildings and different situations, and there's so many different things that they can put in there that just I remember even one of the salon that I had purchased a long time ago. It's in a shopping plaza with a ton of other businesses. And I was responsible for paying the property taxes on the business. All of us were like, we all split that amount of money, all the businesses. But that was not something, I mean, it's like a $1,500 a year extra that I would have to pay for their property tax, which seems silly. But there's those kinds of little hidden fees like that in a ton of leases. And so I think when you don't know those things and then they come up and sneak up on you because it's very shiny. Like I've been in that situation too, but I'm like, oh yeah, this is gorgeous. This space is amazing. This is going to be great. And you do get kind of like clouded as to, I'll just make it work. I'll figure it out. It's going to be fine. They've been doing it, so it must be fine. Right. And then you realize like that's why they're selling their business because they actually have any money because they can afford it. And so it's very easy to get those rose colored glasses on and miss those kinds of things. But you really have to be careful there. And remember, you also have negotiating power. So if somebody's getting out of a lease, you can sometimes negotiate something lower for taking it over if you can prove like maybe you're a really good tenant, you've got whatever background. So you do have some negotiating power too. So don't forget that when you are taking over a lease and having to go into to do all that process.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. You really do have a little bit of power, and make sure that you go into conversations with that power because it's really important. I am appalled. I'm not even going to lie at what these commercial leases look like anymore. They literally add everything in there. It is absolutely insane. I mean, in Texas, it's normal to pay the property tax. Like that's just what you do. And you know, back in the day, I mean, when you leased a space, if something broke, the landlord fixed it. That's not how these commercial leases are written anymore. If it's a $15,000 AC unit, you got to pay for it. You got to fix it. So you need to be very, very careful and read these. One of the other things that you want to look at when you're thinking about the lease and the space itself is the equipment that you're getting as well. So look at that equipment, make sure it's good, but look at things like the plumbing, the electrical, all of that stuff that comes into play because that's going to affect you big time later on if you're not careful. Once again, from experience, there was horrible plumbing in the building that I moved into. It was a couple of months after it cracked our entire floor, like came up from underneath, flooded the salon. Huge mess, huge ordeal, cost a fortune that I didn't have because I had just purchased the business. And so, you know, you can do your due diligence. Sometimes things just happen, but definitely hire somebody to come out and look, hire an attorney, do all of the things that you need to do. Okay, I think the last thing that we need to talk about is what actually happens with the team and the clients when ownership changes. I think this is a part that nobody can really fully map out for you ahead of time. And so you've got to think about it. I think this is also where people kind of walk in expecting things to stay steady because on the outside it looks good. You know what I mean? The team seems happy, the salon's busy, clients are coming in like crazy, and it feels like you are just going to continue taking over something that's going to keep moving in the same way. But that's not the reality. The second that ownership changes, the energy in the business changes, whether you admit it or not. It's the reality. It would be the same. Chandra and I do things very, very similarly. But if I were to take over her salon and vice versa, things would change. It is what it is, right? The team is going to start paying attention to things immediately. They're watching how you lead, how you communicate, what you focus on, what feels different, and what that actually means for them. And even if nothing major changes right away, people still have questions in the back of their mind. Am I going to like working here now? Is this going to feel the same? Are expectations going to change? And everyone handles that differently. And you have to understand that. Some people lean in, they get really, really excited. And then some people kind of hang back and they just watch and observe. And some people kind of start disconnecting themselves before anybody even says anything. You're dealing with a lot of different personalities. So I think you have to walk into this knowing you're not just taking over a business. You are stepping into a group of people who are used to being led in a certain way. And the second that you take over, that leadership is going to change, and you have to be a little calm about it and understanding about it because it's going to be different. I think the same thing kind of happens on the client side. It just shows up a little differently. Clients are very routine based, right? They like knowing what to expect, who they're going to be seeing, how things feel when they walk into your studio. And even if their actual appointment doesn't change much, they can still feel when something changes inside of a business. Sometimes it may be subtle, sure, but sometimes it's not. Either way, people are going to notice it. So I think this is less about trying to predict exactly who is going to stay or leave and more about understanding that there is going to be a transition period where things feel just a little bit unsettled. Chandra, when you've seen ownership transitions happen, what do you think makes the biggest difference in whether a team actually settles in and they feel secure versus they just stay in that unsure kind of wait and see, wait and play it out type of mentality?
I mean, I think having a really clear plan with the current owner for that transition, like really understanding their team, knowing what each of the team members are like, really kind of devising a plan of how you're going to handle presenting that new information to them or making that transition over, and having that support of the current owner in every single way. Because I think when they see that, unless it's a bad situation, maybe it'd be different, but when they if it's a good transition, when they see that, that owner's really care, has their back, really cares about them, and is helping to transition them into this new situation. And if things are different, or if things are going to be different from what they're used to, then you have a plan for that. Like, this is walking them through it. You don't just walk in and blow it all up, instantly. Like, you have to know what they're used to, know what they've been doing, and then start to kind of have a plan of how you're going to switch them over to your way. And I think those are the most successful ones. I think the ones that we see that really have gone bad, or that we've heard stories about, are the ones where the owners come in and just think, I'm just going to take this over and I'm changing all these things. And here's a new handbook and a new manual. And this is how we do things. And half the team leaves or more.
Yeah, absolutely true. I want to get your opinion on this really quickly. How do you feel about the previous owner staying on after ownership changes? Because I have my definite feelings about it, but I'm curious to see what you think.
I mean, so it's kind of funny because in my personal opinion, I don't know that I would want the owner to stay on. I think I would want them to move along so that I could step in and make those changes. But I think it depends on the situation, because I do know a couple people that have transitioned that way, and the owners are still working in those salons for years later, and it's been totally fine. So I think it just depends on who you are, who they are, maybe the relationship that you guys have. But I think 9 times out of 10, if you're really trying to get that team to follow your ways, your culture, all of that stuff, sometimes having the old owner there can combat that. And they can still think they're going to go to the old owner for things, or they're going to complain about things they don't like to that owner. And I think that can cause a lot of problems. So I've seen it go both ways. But for myself personally, I mean, I say that, but then, like, my ex business partner still works for me, and she was an owner at the time. But our relationship is very different in how we handle things, and we support each other first. And we don't get involved, like, in anything when we made that transition. So, yeah, that's my opinion.
I agree with it. I think it works out very, very rarely when you have the previous owner stay on. I really do. But I mean, there's always that off chance, right? So definitely, if you're out there and you're thinking about purchasing a pre existing one, definitely think about that. That's a big, because I find 9 times out of 10, the owner offers to stay on for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is. So just be very intentional about how you build out that transition plan and what you really want. Okay. So if you've been listening to all of this and your brain is kind of spinning just a little bit right now, like you're realizing there's a lot more to this than what you originally thought, let's slow it down for a second and just make this really simple. Because the last thing that Chandra and I want is for you to walk away from this feeling overwhelmed, or worse, where you're still kind of guessing your way through a decision like this. We want to help you be educated when it comes to this. So here's a really simple way that you can approach this, just a basic checklist you can lean on if you ever find yourself in this situation. First thing, slow down. Slow down. I know that sounds simple, but this is where people go wrong right away, I think. They get excited, they feel like they found something good, and they start rushing because they don't want to lose it. I understand. I'm telling you right now, though, that's how people end up stuck in businesses that they regret buying later on. You've got to give yourself enough time to actually look at this from a clear standpoint. There will always, always, always be another opportunity, but you do not want to rush into the wrong one. Next, get everything up front. And I mean everything, not a summary, not just what that owner feels like sending you, not pieces of it. You want everything. 3 full years minimal, I would say, of financials, full payroll breakdowns, provider production reports, the full lease agreement, anything that shows you how the business actually runs. And if there is hesitation around giving you that, or if things feel incomplete, that's not something that you want to ignore. That is something to pay attention to very closely. Then you want to look at each piece on its own, right? Don't try to make sense of everything all at once, because that's where things start slipping through the cracks. Sit down with each and every piece individually and make sure that you review it. After that, pressure test it. And this is where you've got to be honest with yourself. Not best case scenario thinking, not assuming everything stays the same, but real scenarios. If the owner steps out and that revenue drops, is this still going to work? If 1 or 2 people leave, does it still work for you? If expenses are higher than you expected, or something needs to be fixed right away, does this still work? Because if the business only works when everything goes perfectly, it's not a strong business, and it's probably not something you want to be a part of. That's just my opinion. And then last, make the decision based on what is real, not how you feel. Emotions have to go. It can't be because you love the space. It can't be because you're excited. It can't be because it seems easier than starting from scratch. Look at everything in front of you and ask yourself, does this actually make sense as a business? Does it make sense for my family and my life? Is it going to support me? Is it going to support my team? And is it going to give me room to grow? At the end of the day, it's not just a space that you're stepping into. The second that you sign those papers, it becomes something that you are fully responsible for. Chandra, when someone makes a really good decision with something like this versus one they regret a whole lot later on, what do you feel like they did differently?
Well, I just think it comes down to the research. Like, I think that they did their research. They put the time in. They really went through the documents that they needed, the financials that they needed, maybe really had some very deep conversations with the current owner and just really figured out what the clear picture was like. I think those ones are definitely the most successful ones.
I agree with that 100%. 100%. Do not rush on anything like this. I used to get so frustrated. My dad is a very, very intelligent businessman. And I used to get so frustrated with him because he takes too much time sometimes in researching businesses and things like that. Obviously, he has made himself bukus of money in doing things that way. But sometimes it's hard to sit back and watch it take 6, 8 months to purchase a business, because we live in this world of instant gratification and we want what we want right when we want it. And so it is really hard, but I'm telling you, some of the smartest business people out there, they are patient with everything that they do. So, all right, before we wrap up, I want to jump into our listener question of the week. This one came in from Amelia in South Dakota, and this is what she asked. How do you handle it when a team member starts becoming really close with clients outside of the salon, like texting them, hanging out, building relationships that feel just a little too personal? At what point does that become a problem, and how do you address it without it turning into a bigger issue? Chandra, I'm going to toss that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from the very beginning, like what your standards are and what your expectations are around this. There needs to be some sort of policy set. Like we have that, even in my salon, like there's a line in the sand, there's a professional line and there's a friend line. And that's just a line that we don't cross. And everybody knows that. I will say there have been instances over the years where maybe, just a client and that stylist, they just meshed really good together. They hit it off really good together. And it seemed like more of a friendly level. But, we always are very upfront about that. And it's happened maybe twice ever. It's just been kind of one of those fluky things. And I think that's the biggest thing is that communication, keeping it open, making sure those expectations are there. Because when that has happened, I've had team members come up to me and say, hey, we started talking on Instagram and then this, and then whatever. And I'm like, but when you are here, like you're still charging them. There's still a professional line that has to be drawn in the sand. And so I think that's the biggest thing is what do you expect from the beginning? And if you don't have anything, that's when it's going to be hard. So I would create those policies, create what your expectations are, make sure your team knows going forward, and then, just enforce it from there. But usually it's a non-issue when you have that.
I agree with that. I think that is excellent advice. Sometimes people just don't understand. They don't realize what a bad breakup in a friendship can do to them professionally and to the business as a whole. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more talk about this and education about this, not for just commission salon employees, but for solo stylists as well. When you don't have that line between professional and personal, it can cause a lot of issues really, really quickly. I look at, we've got a lot of young people in hair school nowadays, and you look at high school and, they're friends with somebody one week and then enemies the next week. And that can really take a toll on your business if you're not careful. And so I think it's something that we do as owners need to make sure that we talk about a little bit more and always have those clear expectations, like Chandra said. All right. As we wrap this up, I want to bring it back to just everything that we were talking about. Buying an existing salon or spa can be a really great move. It can, but only if you actually take the time to understand what you're stepping into. It's not just a space and it's not just numbers on paper. You're stepping into how that business has been run, how that team operates, what those financials really look like, and what may change the second that you take over. And I think the biggest mistake people make is assuming that what they see is exactly what they're going to get. That's just not how it always works. Trust me, been there, done that. So if this is something you're even considering, do not rush it. Don't guess your way through it, and definitely do not make a decision based off of excitement alone. Don't do that. Slow it down, walk through everything we talked about, and make sure that it actually makes sense for you. And if you want help kind of sorting through what actually needs attention in your beauty business, whether that is understanding your numbers, evaluating an opportunity like this, building a structure that actually supports you, or just figuring out what your next move should be, you can grab some of our free resources on our website, www.thebeautybizagency.com, or you can check out our coaching options. We also have just opened a few spots with our founders for strategy calls. So if you want to grab one of those, do it soon because they won't be there long for sure. Chandra, if somebody's listening right now and they are thinking about buying a salon and just feeling a little unsure after everything that they heard on the podcast today, what would you say to them?
I mean, I think don't get discouraged about it. The right situation will come along. And so if for some reason that, what you've been looking at is you're getting frustrated because now you're seeing red flags or things and you're emotionally getting upset, the right thing will come along. If it's meant to be, it will come along. So I think don't stress about it. Keep looking, keep working on it. Maybe it's something you can negotiate. Like it doesn't mean it has to be off the table. It just means you have to make a smart decision when you are making that purchase instead of just necessarily exactly what they're asking for. And so do your research and don't get discouraged. The right thing will happen.
1,000,000%. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this episode, send it to another owner who needs to hear it. Also, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss the next episode. And if you've got a second, please leave us a review. They really, really help more than you know. It helps other beauty business owners find our show. And make sure that you're following us on all social media platforms and that you're subscribed to our email list so you don't miss out on anything that we have going on. Chandra, how can they stay in the loop with everything happening at the Beauty Biz Agency?
Yeah, make sure you're following us on Instagram and Facebook at the Beauty Biz Agency and TikTok at the Beauty Biz Mentors. And shoot us a message. Let us know if you have any questions you want us to answer on the air. We always check those and we always like to help you out. So definitely stay in touch.
Absolutely. That's a wrap. You've been listening to the Beauty Biz Breakdown, where salon owners stop looking at the surface and start understanding what's really driving their business. Until next time, don't let excitement make the decision for you. Make sure the numbers and the structure back it up. Now go out there, make bank, run the show, and ditch that chair. And as always, keep slaying those business goals with a whole lot of swagger. If this episode lit a fire under you, don't just walk away and let it die out. Deep down, you already know where you want your business and your life to go. And the truth is, the only thing standing between where you are and where you want to be is a real plan to get you there. That's exactly what we help you build. So if you're ready to stop trying to figure it out on your own, head to thebeautybizagency.com and book your free strategy call. That call can give you the clarity that you've been needing and a real plan to move your business forward. Because at the end of the day, the only thing standing between you and the salon business you've been dreaming about is whether or not you're willing to take the action and the steps in order to build it.